Shadows in the Gulf. The South China Sea shimmered beneath the relentless glare of the August sun, an endless mirror of molten blue that masked secrets both natural and man-made. It was the kind of heat that clung to skin like a second uniform, and even the wind seemed to whisper with a warning. Above the waves, the USS Maddox sliced a solitary path through the uneasy waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, her steel-gray hull gleaming faintly as it rolled gently with the swells. Officially, she was on a patrol mission, routine, unprovocative, part of a wider intelligence-gathering operation, but every man aboard knew better. The tension was a living thing, as heavy as the tropical air. Below decks, the hum of sonar pulses and the rhythmic ping of radar filled the cramped, sweat-dampened operations room, creating a strange, mechanical heartbeat. Sonarmen leaned into their scopes, eyes narrowed, hands poised over headsets as they listened for any sign of underwater movement, any flicker that might suggest a hostile presence. On the bridge, officers scanned the horizon with binoculars, while signalmen rotated antenna arrays and radio operators kept their ears pressed to crackling headphones. Everyone was alert. Everyone was waiting. The year was 1964, and the Cold War, while nominally cold, was flaring with heat and blood in jungles and backwaters across the globe. Berlin had its walls. Cuba had nearly brought the world to nuclear ruin just 2 years earlier. But now it was Southeast Asia's turn to burn. Vietnam was no longer just a colonial question or a regional conflict. It was the crucible of an ideological war that was steadily drawing in superpowers. For the United States, the fight against communism had found a new front line. North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh, was growing bolder, funneling weapons and men down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to aid the Viet Cong insurgency in the South. The United States, already backing South Vietnam with military advisors and logistical support, had begun pushing the envelope with clandestine naval operations designed to pressure the North and monitor its coastal activities. These missions, code-named DeSoto patrols, involved intelligence-gathering runs in international waters, technically legal, but perceived by the North Vietnamese as provocations just shy of acts of war. The Maddox, a Forrest Sherman-class destroyer, had been dispatched on one such mission. She was sleek, heavily armed, and equipped with advanced radar and sonar for her time. Her orders were to patrol off the North Vietnamese coast, gathering signals intelligence for the National Security Agency and monitoring communist naval movements. But the reality was more complex. Just before her patrol, South Vietnamese commandos, supported indirectly by the U.S., had launched attacks against North Vietnamese coastal targets. From Hanoi's perspective, the presence of an American warship so soon afterward was not coincidental. As the Maddox edged closer to the coast, slicing through the muggy air and foamy waves, the crew remained on edge. Eyes scanned the skies, the sea, and the sonar readouts for the slightest anomaly. Beneath the calm surface of the Gulf, shadows danced, some real, some imagined. Reports of torpedo boats operating in the area only heightened the unease. Deck-mounted guns sat ready, manned by sailors who had been drilled relentlessly on how to respond to an attack. Below, the engine room throbbed with heat and energy, ready to push the ship into evasive action at a moment's notice. For many of the sailors, this was not what they had imagined when they enlisted. Most had never heard of the Gulf of Tonkin before being deployed there. The names and politics of Southeast Asia were still foreign to many Americans. But here they were, floating in contested waters off the coast of a country they were not officially at war with, preparing for an encounter that might never come, or might come with lethal swiftness. Every hour ticked by like a slow drumbeat, an ominous countdown towards something just out of sight. What the crew didn't yet know was that their presence, alongside a web of escalating covert operations and political calculations, would soon ignite a flashpoint that would change the trajectory of history. Events were unfolding that would ripple far beyond the humid stillness of the Gulf. Within days, shots would be fired. Reports would flood Washington, and the President of the United States would stand before Congress to ask for sweeping powers to respond. But for now, aboard the USS Maddox, it was just the sea, the sun, and the silent menace of a war that had not yet officially begun, but had already drawn them in. The Maddox, a sleek and formidable 2,200-ton Forrest Sherman-class destroyer, cut through the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin with practiced ease. Her gray hull bore the marks of countless nautical miles, and her superstructure bristled with antennas, radar dishes, and armament. A warship made for both detection and defense. Outwardly, her presence in the area was a matter of routine. She was operating under the banner of the U.S. Navy's DeSoto patrols, a series of missions designed to collect electronic signals intelligence along the coastlines of communist-controlled nations. The official story was that the Maddox was conducting surveillance, measuring radar emissions, intercepting radio traffic, and mapping North Vietnam's coastal defenses. But anyone aboard her decks could feel the truth humming just below the surface. This was no ordinary patrol. The waters she sailed were calm, the skies high and blue, but tension hung thick in the salty air. Every sailor aboard knew this wasn't just about signals collection. It was about provocation, about testing the limits of North Vietnam's patience. The ship was moving deliberately close to the country's territorial waters, sailing just inside what Washington insisted was international space, but which Hanoi viewed as a flagrant intrusion. The destroyer wasn't just observing, she was taunting, baiting, measuring the enemy's response with every revolution of her propellers. And the timing was anything but coincidental. Just days earlier, South Vietnamese commandos had launched a series of lightning raids against North Vietnamese coastal targets, specifically radar installations that were critical to Hanoi's early warning and air defense systems. These raids, part of the clandestine Operation 34A, were conducted with American training, equipment, and support. While Washington maintained plausible deniability, it was no secret among military insiders that the CIA and other U.S. agencies had backed these attacks. The North Vietnamese leadership, well aware of the American hand behind the strikes, saw the Maddox not as an innocent observer, but as a sentry for more aggressive moves to come. To the officers and enlisted men aboard the Maddox, that made their presence far more dangerous than it appeared on paper. Her mission might have been written in the language of surveillance, but her actual role was far more provocative. In the high-stakes chessboard of Cold War power projection, the Maddox was a knight creeping ever closer to the opposing king. Her patrol routes had been drawn to parallel sensitive areas along North Vietnam's coast, radar hubs, military outposts, suspected patrol boat bases. Every blip she recorded on radar, every burst of static caught on her radio arrays, was being fed back into the growing American war machine's intelligence networks. The crew operated under an uneasy silence. While the orders were clear, the situation was murky. There was no declared war, no lines drawn in the sand, no clear enemy ship to engage unless provoked. Yet the threat was real. North Vietnamese torpedo boats, small, fast, and armed, had been spotted in the region. The possibility of engagement was more than theoretical. Weapons crews remained on alert, gunners manned their stations, and officers on the bridge kept constant watch on the horizon, scanning the calm seas for the faintest flicker of movement that might signal an attack. The Maddox herself was well armed for her time, equipped with 3 5-inch 54 caliber guns capable of unleashing deadly barrages at both sea and air targets, and advanced radar and sonar systems. She was more than a match for small craft, but she was still alone. A solitary destroyer, hundreds of miles from backup, prowling near hostile shores in a volatile part of the world. The crew understood the risks. They knew that if trouble came, it would come fast and without warning. And it would come. What the Maddox's patrol truly represented was a collision of strategy and secrecy. In Washington, planners were watching with interest. The Johnson administration, already leaning toward deeper involvement in Vietnam, saw these operations as a way to exert pressure, test Hanoi's resolve, and justify potential escalation. In Hanoi, leaders viewed the destroyer's presence as the next step in a slow but deliberate campaign of aggression. The sea between them was growing smaller, and in the middle floated a single American ship, daring the storm to break. Unseen, under the surface of diplomacy and defense reports, the trap was being set. Every sonar ping, every radar sweep, every command sent over secured frequencies was part of a larger equation. The Maddox, far from being a passive observer, had become the center of a brewing confrontation, one that would soon burst into the headlines, into Congress, and into the wider war that was still only a shadow on the horizon. In the quiet hum of her engines and the disciplined routines of her crew, the destroyer sailed toward history. Few aboard the Maddox understood the full extent of the covert operations unfolding behind the scenes. They didn't need to. The atmosphere alone was enough to speak volumes. It was in the clipped voices of the officers, in the quiet precision of the sonar technicians, and in the way the sailors lingered a little longer at their stations, scanning the flat horizon for anything that seemed out of place. Below decks, the rhythmic sonar pings echoed off the steel bulkheads like the distant tolling of a clock, measured, mechanical, but ominous, as though counting down to something no one could quite name. Above deck, a different rhythm ruled, the restless movement of boots on steel, the creak of gun turrets, the whisper of wind carrying heat and salt across the sea. The water was unnervingly calm, reflecting the sky in perfect stillness, but it was a calm that felt like a curtain drawn over something waiting to strike. Captain John J. Herrick, the commanding officer of the Maddox, stood on the bridge with eyes trained on the sea ahead. A career officer with decades of experience, Herrick was no stranger to risk. But this patrol had a sharper edge. He knew that what they were doing, probing the North Vietnamese coastline so soon after covert commando raids, was more than intelligence gathering. It was a message wrapped in radar waves and radio signals. "We see you. We're here. What will you do about it?" As the Maddox neared Hon May Island on the afternoon of August 2nd, 1964, the message was returned. Radar operators first spotted them, fast-moving blips on the screen, cutting across the Gulf's waters with predatory intent. Then lookouts on deck confirmed the sighting with binoculars, 3 small, fast, low-profile vessels skimming the waves. They were unmistakable. Soviet-built P-4 torpedo boats, sleek and deadly, each armed with twin 14.5mm heavy machine guns and a pair of torpedoes slung in angled launch tubes. These weren't patrol craft making a routine pass. Their formation was aggressive. Their course was direct. Their purpose was unmistakable. Herrick immediately ordered the crew to battle stations. Klaxons wailed through the ship. Boots pounded down metal corridors. Hatches slammed shut. Within seconds, the Maddox transformed from a reconnaissance vessel into a war machine. Her 5-inch guns swiveled to face the oncoming threat, and gunners took their positions, hands poised on firing controls, eyes steady behind targeting sights. At precisely 2 p.m., the moment of decision arrived. The torpedo boats had closed the distance to within striking range, weaving through the waves in a coordinated zigzag pattern, an evasive maneuver that doubled as a clear sign of hostile intent. The Maddox issued warnings, radio transmissions, flares, even a burst of signal gunfire over the bows of the approaching boats. But the P-4s didn't slow. Instead, they opened fire with their machine guns, sending red tracers arcing through the air toward the American destroyer. That was all the provocation needed. The Maddox's forward turret roared to life. Massive 5-inch shells screamed across the water, slamming into the sea near the torpedo boats. The blasts sent geysers of water skyward and rocked the small craft with deadly force. One boat veered hard, the others kept coming. Another salvo rang out, this time aimed to kill. Metal ripped, spray exploded, and flames licked up from one of the enemy craft. The deck of the destroyer was alive with motion. Officers shouting coordinates, gunners adjusting for range, lookouts calling enemy movements. Overhead, Salvation screamed in from the sky. 2 F-8 Crusader jet fighters scrambled from the nearby aircraft carrier USS Ticonderoga, streaked into the fray at supersonic speed. The Crusaders had been flying cover in anticipation of trouble, and now it had arrived. Diving low over the sea, the jets locked onto the torpedo boats and unleashed bursts from their 20mm cannons. The air split with the thunder of gunfire, tracer rounds slashing across the water, punching into the hulls of the North Vietnamese vessels. One boat exploded into flames, another turned away, trailing smoke. The third zigzagged furiously, attempting to escape the onslaught. Within minutes, the confrontation was over. One torpedo boat had been left crippled and burning. The others were retreating, limping back toward the North Vietnamese coast, battered but not sunk. The Maddox had suffered only minor damage. An enemy round had struck one of her gun mounts, but no crewmen were seriously injured. It had been a lopsided fight, with superior American firepower and air support overwhelming the lighter and more maneuverable Vietnamese boats. But the implications of the clash loomed large. On the Maddox, the adrenaline was still surging. Sailors exhaled slowly, gunners wiped sweat from their brows, officers relayed after-action reports. They had held the line, they had defended the ship. But more than that, they had opened a door, one that could not be easily closed. For Captain Herrick, the moment was sobering. The confrontation had not been an accident. It was the result of an intricate, dangerous dance of provocation and response, one that now seemed poised to spiral beyond anyone's control. He radioed Washington immediately with a full report, including radar data, gunfire exchanges, and enemy maneuvers. The skirmish was over, but the echoes of gunfire were already reverberating back across the Pacific, toward desks and decision-makers who would use this incident as a pivot point. In less than 24 hours, the world would know about what had happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. But for the men aboard the Maddox, history wasn't something to be read in newspapers. It was something they had just lived through, barrel by barrel, shell by shell. And the war was only beginning. In minutes, it was over. Smoke drifted low over the Gulf as the echoes of gunfire faded into the sea breeze. One North Vietnamese P-4 boat was crippled and drifting, another limped westward, trailing thick black smoke, its deck scarred with cannon fire. The third had disengaged early, darting back toward the coast with erratic movements. On the USS Maddox, there was an almost eerie silence after the fury, save for the muted voices on the radios, the groan of rotating gun turrets returning to idle, and the creaking of the hull as the ship resumed her patrol course. No American sailors were injured. The Maddox herself was virtually untouched. But while the skirmish had ended quickly, its reverberations were only beginning. The message from the North Vietnamese was unmistakable. They were willing to fight back. For the American crew, it had been a sharp, jarring collision with reality. They had entered these waters expecting tension, but not a firefight. The belief that U.S. naval power would go unchallenged had just been torpedoed, figuratively, if not yet literally. And somewhere in the blur of tracer fire and sonar pings, a line had been crossed. By that evening, the first reports began streaming into Washington. The capital, normally hushed during the lazy heat of late summer, stirred into sudden motion. Analysts pored over communiques. The Pentagon scrambled for confirmation. The press, fed only tidbits, began sniffing for a story. But it was inside the White House that the gravity of the situation landed hardest. President Lyndon B. Johnson, still adjusting to the weight of the presidency after John F. Kennedy's assassination less than a year prior, now faced a test that could define his tenure. Johnson had grand ambitions at home: the Great Society, civil rights, war on poverty. But overseas, the world was changing. Communism seemed to be spreading relentlessly. China had just tested its first atomic bomb. The Soviet Union still loomed. And in Southeast Asia, the communist North Vietnamese continued to support the insurgency in the South. Johnson gathered with his top advisors: Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, State Department officials, intelligence analysts. The mood was tense. They debated the incident aboard the Maddox, what had happened, what it meant, and how to respond. Some urged restraint. Others saw an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate U.S. resolve, to deliver a firm warning to Hanoi. Johnson, a shrewd political operator, recognized the tightrope he walked. On one side was the risk of American entanglement in another foreign war, a political and moral quagmire like Korea. On the other, the specter of appearing weak on communism, unacceptable in an election year. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, he realized, could be both a trap and a tool. His decision was cautious, but deliberate. He ordered the Maddox to remain on station, but she would no longer patrol alone. The USS Turner Joy, another destroyer, was dispatched to reinforce her sister ship. Together, they would resume operations in the contested waters of the Gulf, sending a clear signal to North Vietnam that the U.S. would not back down. It was, on the surface, a show of strength, but beneath it churned a storm of uncertainty. Then came August 4th. The night was moonless, the air thick and still, the sky overcast in a way that made even experienced watchstanders nervous. The Gulf of Tonkin was shrouded in blackness, broken only by the dim red glow of deck lights and the steady sweep of radar antennas. At approximately 8 p.m., the calm was shattered. From both the Maddox and Turner Joy, frantic transmissions began pouring in. Radar screens lit up with fast-approaching contacts. Sonar picked up what sounded like torpedoes in the water, multiple, circling, closing. Lookouts reported flashes on the horizon, mysterious wakes darting through the darkness. "We're under attack," the destroyers radioed. "Multiple contacts. Maneuvering to evade." The destroyers zigzagged wildly, lighting up the night with shell bursts from their 5-inch guns. Depth charges splashed into the sea. Emergency maneuvers were initiated. Pilots were scrambled from the Ticonderoga, circling high overhead, scanning for enemy craft. But in the swirling dark, they could see nothing. No torpedo boats, no muzzle flashes, no debris, nothing but the open sea. For over 2 hours, the chaos continued. Radar operators reported blips, then lost them. Sonar pings bounced off phantom contacts. Some crew believed they saw silhouettes in the distance, shadows slipping through the black water, but others weren't so sure. Back in Washington, the situation was tense. Johnson was briefed within minutes of the reports. The Pentagon treated the new attack as fact. Orders were drawn up for retaliation, but not everyone was convinced. Even aboard the Maddox, skepticism began to grow. Captain Herrick, calm under pressure, reviewed the data and began to doubt. Sea conditions had worsened. High-speed maneuvers had created turbulence that could confuse sonar. Radar systems, sensitive and prone to ghosting in poor weather, were showing inconsistent results. No torpedoes had been observed hitting, no wreckage had been found. And the pilots flying overhead? They had seen nothing. By midnight, Herrick was openly questioning whether an attack had even occurred. But in the halls of Washington power, the momentum had already built. The narrative was clear. The United States Navy had been attacked twice in 48 hours in international waters. The time for measured patience had passed. For Johnson and his administration, whether the second attack was real or not became almost irrelevant. What mattered now was perception. and how it could be shaped. What followed was a storm of confusion, chaotic, disorienting, and eerily surreal. The USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy sliced through the black waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, their hulls groaning under the stress of high-speed evasive turns. On the bridges of both ships, red emergency lights cast long shadows over the faces of crewmen hunched over radar and sonar screens. The air inside was stifling, filled with the overlapping sounds of shouted orders, radar pings, sonar alarms, and the rapid clack of communications equipment. At 8:40 p.m., a voice crackled over the intercom from CIC, Combat Information Center. "Multiple contacts, bearing 345, closing fast." Officers squinted at their scopes, trying to make sense of the green blips that flickered into life and vanished just as quickly. Were they real? Were they enemy torpedo boats? Or just phantoms, echoes, weather anomalies? The orders came down fast. "All hands to battle stations," claxons wailed throughout the destroyers as sailors scrambled to their positions. Gun crews loaded 5-inch shells into breeches. Engine rooms roared to full power. The destroyers turned sharply, laying down wake patterns meant to confuse incoming torpedoes. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness, scanning for silhouettes on the water. Lookouts pressed binoculars to their eyes, trying to penetrate the black void ahead. Suddenly, sonar screamed. "Torpedoes in the water!" A flurry of commands followed. "Hard to port! Increase speed. Deploy countermeasures." Depth charges were released in controlled bursts, thudding into the sea and sending geysers of water into the air. The destroyers rocked with the concussive force of their own weapons. Gunners opened fire blindly into the night, rounds splashing far out into the void. No visible targets, no muzzle flashes from the enemy, just darkness swallowing everything. From the deck of the Turner Joy, some claimed to see wakes, telltale signs of fast craft slicing through the water. One sailor swore he saw a light flicker on the horizon, like a muzzle flash. But then it was gone. The F-8 Crusaders from the carrier Ticonderoga were overhead within minutes, their engines howling, pilots scanning the sea with infrared and night vision optics. They, too, reported seeing nothing, no boats, no torpedo trails, no evidence of any enemy presence. Inside the CIC, the mood began to shift. As adrenaline faded, doubts crept in. Captain John Herrick aboard the Maddox began piecing together the puzzle from the scattered data. The sonar returns had been erratic, inconsistent. The radar contacts had moved in improbable patterns, some even doubling back on themselves. No visual confirmation had ever been made, and crucially, no damage had been sustained, no debris recovered, and no enemy presence. Inside the CIC, the mood began to shift. As adrenaline faded, doubts crept in. Captain John Herrick aboard the Maddox began piecing together the puzzle from the scattered data. The sonar returns had been erratic, inconsistent. The radar contacts had moved in improbable patterns, some even doubling back on themselves. No visual confirmation had ever been made, and crucially, no damage had been sustained, no debris recovered, and no enemy signals intercepted. Herrick, a seasoned officer known for his composure, made a fateful decision. At 1:27 a.m., he drafted a message to his superiors in Honolulu and Washington. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken. It was a moment of integrity and restraint, a captain resisting the pull of panic. But by then, it was too late. In Washington, events were already galloping ahead of the facts. When the initial reports of the second attack reached the White House, they were treated as confirmation of deliberate North Vietnamese aggression. President Lyndon B. Johnson was in his pajamas when National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy woke him with the news. The U.S. Navy had been attacked, again. The implications were enormous. Johnson, already wary of appearing soft on communism, was now presented with what seemed like a clear-cut act of war. The political moment was ripe for action. A midterm election was looming. Hawks in Congress were pushing for a stronger military stance in Southeast Asia. Johnson himself had long been skeptical of deeper involvement in Vietnam, but this looked like an opportunity to rally national unity, to draw a line in the sand. Within hours, the machinery of retaliation was in motion. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara assured Johnson and Congress that the attacks were unprovoked and real. The Pentagon prepared airstrikes. Johnson, appearing on television, told the American people that the United States had responded with measured and fitting action against aggression on the high seas. The phrase stuck, measured and fitting. It suggested calm resolve, righteous clarity, and above all, certainty. But the truth was far murkier. Within intelligence circles, skepticism simmered. Analysts at the NSA and Pentagon quietly flagged inconsistencies in the reports. Radio intercepts didn't line up. The sonar data was inconclusive. There was no solid proof that the second attack had ever occurred. But dissent was buried beneath the political avalanche. On August 7th, just days after the alleged attack, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only 2 senators opposed. The resolution granted the president sweeping powers to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It would become the legal foundation for a massive escalation of the Vietnam War, an escalation that would cost more than 58,000 American lives and countless Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian casualties. Years later, historians and former officials would revisit that stormy night in the Gulf. Declassified documents, first-hand accounts, and forensic reviews would all point toward the same conclusion. The second attack likely never happened. It had been a ghost battle, born from nervous men, high seas, and the fog of war. But on that night in August 1964, the truth had already been overtaken by urgency.